Strickland by Rudyard Kipling. I ordered 2 boxes and handed them over to the size with my love. That size was Strickland, and he was in old Yoel's employ attached to Miss Yoel's Arab. The poor fellow was suffering for an English smoke, and knew that whatever happened I should hold my tongue till the business was over. Later on Mrs. Yoel, who was wrapped up in her servants, began talking at houses, where she called of her paragon among saysest man, who was never too busy to get up in the morning, and pick flowers for the breakfastable, and who blacked hoofs of his horse like a London coachman. The turnout of Miss Yoel's Arab was a wonder, and a delight. Strickland found his reward in the pretty things that Miss Yoel said to him. When she went out riding, her parents were pleased to find she had forgotten all her foolishness for young Strickland, and said she was a good girl. Strickland vows that the 2 months of his service were the most rigid mental discipline he has ever gone through, quite apart from the little fact that the wife of one of his fellow sazes fell in love with him, and then tried to poison him with arsenic, because he would have nothing to do with her. He had to school himself into keeping quiet when Miss Yoel went out riding with some man who tried to flirt with her, and he was forced to trot behind carrying the blanket, and hearing every word. Also, he had to keep his temper when he was slanged in Benmore Porch by a policeman, especially once when he was abused by a nake. He had himself recruited from Isser Jang village, or worse still, when a young subaltern called him a pig for not making way quickly enough. But the life had its compensations. He obtained great insight into the ways and thefts of Sazasenuf. He says to have summarily convicted half the Chamar population of the Punjab. If he had been on business, he became one of the leading players at knucklebones, which all Jampanis and many Sazes play while they are waiting outside the government house, or the Gaiety Theatre of Nights. He learned to smoke tobacco that was 3/4 cowdung, and he heard the wisdom of the grizzled jemadar of the government house, Sazes, whose words are valuable. He saw many things which amused him, and he states on honor that no man can appreciate Simla properly till he has seen it from the Sayas point of view. He also says that if he chose to write all, he saw his head would be broken in several places. Strickland's account of the agony he endured on wet nights hearing the music, and seeing the lights in Benmore with his toes tingling for a waltz and his head in a horse blanket, is rather amusing. One of these days, Strickland is going to write a little book on his experiences. That book will be worth buying, and even more worth suppressing. Thus he served faithfully as Jacob served for Rachel, and his leave was nearly at an end. When the explosion came, he had really done his best to keep his temper in the hearing of the flirtations I have mentioned. But he broke down at last. An old and very distinguished general took Miss Yoel for a ride, and began that specially offensive Yori only a little girl sort of flirtation, most difficult for a woman to turn aside deftly, and most maddening to listen to. Miss Yoel was shaking with fear at the things he said in the hearing of her size. Strickland stood it as long as he could. Then he caught hold of the general's bridle, and in most fluent English invited him to step off and be heaved over the cliff. Next minute, Miss Yoel began crying, and Strickland saw that he had hopelessly given himself away, and everything was over. The general nearly had a fit, while Miss Yoel was sobbing out the story of the disguise, and the engagement that wasn't recognized by the parents. Strickland was furiously angry with himself, and more angry with the general for forcing his hand, so he said nothing, but held the horse's head, and prepared to thrash the general as some sort of satisfaction. But when the general had thoroughly grasped the story, and knew who Strickland was, he began to puff and blow in the saddle, and nearly rolled off with laughing. He said Strickland deserved a Roman 5 Roman 100, if it were only for putting on a sayus blanket. Then he called himself names, and vowed that he deserved a thrashing, but he was too old to take it from Strickland. Then he complimented Miss Yoel on her lover. The scandal of the business never struck him, for he was a nice old man with a weakness for flirtations. Then he laughed again, and said that old Yoel was a fool. Strickland let go of the cob's head, and suggested that the general had better help them, if that was his opinion. Strickland knew Yoel's weakness for men with titles and letters after their names, and high official position. "It's rather like a 40-minute farce," said the general, "but begad I will help if it's only to escape that tremendous thrashing I deserved. Go along to your home, my size policeman, and change into decent kit, and ill attack Mr. Yoel. Miss Yoel, may I ask you to canter home and wait?" About 7 minutes later, there was a wild hurroosh at the club. A size with a blanket and headrope was asking all the men he knew, for heaven's sake, lend me decent clothes. As the men did not recognize him, there were some peculiar scenes before Strickland could get a hot bath with soda in it, in one room a shirt, here a collar, there a pair of trousers elsewhere. And so on he galloped off with half the club wardrobe on his back, and an utter stranger's pony under him to the house of old Yole. The general arrayed in purple and fine linen was before him. What the general had said Strickland never knew, but Yole received Strickland with moderate civility, and Mrs. Yole, touched by the devotion of the transformed Dullu, was almost kind. The general beamed and chuckled, and Miss Yole came in, and almost before old Yole knew where he was the parental consent had been wrenched out, and Strickland had departed with Miss Yole to the telegraph office to wire for his kit. The final embarrassment was when an utter stranger attacked him on the mall and asked for the stolen pony. So in the end, Strickland and Miss Yole were married on the strict understanding that Strickland should drop his old ways and stick to departmental routine, which pays best and leads to Simla. Strickland was far too fond of his wife just then to break his word, but it was a sore trial to him, for the streets and the bazaars and the sounds in them were full of meaning to Strickland, and these called to him to come back and take up his wanderings and his discoveries some day. I will tell you how. He broke his promise to help a friend that was long since, and he has by this time been nearly spoilt for what he would call shikar. He is forgetting the slang and the beggar's cant, and the marks, and the signs, and the drift of the undercurrents, which if a man would master he must always continue to learn. But he fills in his departmental returns beautifully.